Thanks for coming to our Applied Math Colloquium. Our speaker today is Dr. Professor Emery Brown. I'd like to give him an especially warm welcome. He's an old friend of mine from our graduate school days together, where we used to both work on circadian rhythms with the same research group at Harvard Medical School. But, there's some old expression about good things come in threes. Is that right? I think Emery has lived that out in many different ways. So, for instance, he went to Harvard and got 3 degrees there. An undergraduate degree in applied math, and PhD in statistics, and a medical degree from Harvard Medical School. So that's his first 3. Then, he's currently affiliated with 3 august institutions in the Boston area. There's Mass General Hospital, one of the world's great hospitals. There's MIT, fine technical institute, and still Harvard Medical School. And then he's also one of the few people on the planet in the history of the world to be in 3 national academies: National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, and the National Academy of Medicine. Except that my neat little theory with the 3 threes doesn't exactly work, because I find from his bio that he's also in the National Academy of Inventors. So you've messed me up. All right, but he's really done very beautiful fundamental work about how anesthesia works from a neuroscientific and statistical perspective, and that's what he's going to tell us about today. Very happy to have my old pal here, Emery. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for all of you for coming. So I'm going to talk to you about, as I said, deciphering dynamics and unconscious brain under general anesthesia. And you'll see why I'm talking about dynamics and unconsciousness in just a second. So before I begin, I just really want to acknowledge the people that I've had the good fortune to do this work with. So this is my colleague Patrick Purdon, who I've worked with for a number of years at Mass General Hospital, bioengineer and neuroscientist. My good friend and collaborator Nancy Capel, who's helped, and many of you know, is an expert in dynamical systems and quantum and biological rhythms. Shinda Keiji, who's an anesthesiologist, clinician researcher at MGH. Ken Sulk is also an anesthesiology clinician researcher at MGH. Laura Lewis, who's one of my PhD students, is now at Boston University on faculty. Notice Naranjo, who's my colleague from Merida in Yucatan Peninsula. Amir Zanichi, my former PhD student, who's now on the faculty at USC. Shannon Chang, who's one of our postdocs, who's now at WashU. Ahmad Eskandar, who's cut off. And neurosurgeon, and Sid Cash, who is a neurologist. And then these are the funding sources that I've had the good fortune to have this really supported this work. I'm really grateful for that. So let me just give you an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to first give you a clinical look at general anesthesia. So how many of you have been on the other side? How many have had I'm going to talk specifically about loss of consciousness induced by propofol, like the most commonly used anesthetic. I'm going to show you some things about anesthesia in the aging brain. We're using anesthesia to now learn something about how the brain matures. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas for the future control of medical coma, and also reanimation, turning the brain back on. So here are the main points that I'm going to make. The brain under anesthesia is not turned off. It's actually quite dynamic. And that's one of the main points I'm going to make, and I'll show you this very, very, very shortly. Right? And in fact, what we think now is one of the primary ways in which the drugs are working, and they alter arousal, is by creating oscillations, and these oscillations make it difficult for the various parts of the brain to communicate. That's kind of the take-home message. And then what I want to show you is that these oscillations are very easy to see in the EEG. I'll show you that right away. They change very systematically with drug. You change the drug class, you change the dynamics that you get, and they change very systematically with patient age. And so what I'll show you finally is that you can then use this idea, because the signatures are so robust to build a control system, that you can then use to maybe control anesthetic state. I'll show you some work we've done with that, experimental work. Right? So those are the main ideas. And then finally, reanimation. Right now, we give you drugs to turn the brain off, put you in a state of general anesthesia, but we don't wake you up. We just let the drugs wear off and kind of let you come to. Brain dysfunction after anesthesia is highly prevalent, particularly in those of us who are over 50 years of age. Between 25 to 30% of people over that age will have some type of brain dysfunction, which could be delirium that lasts for a few hours or so after surgery, onto brain dysfunction that could last for several weeks or several months. Now, all of it probably isn't associated with anesthesia. They always had surgery and sickness sort of thing. But anesthesia is certainly playing a role, so we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. So let me start with the definition. So what is general anesthesia? So it's a drug-induced reversible state comprised of unconsciousness. You don't form memories. It shouldn't hurt. It's helpful if you're not moving around while the surgeon's operating. And then if you take these four things here, and you don't have the reversible, it's synonymous with death. So that's not cool. So that's why we have reversible here. And we have stability and control of the physiologic system. And I put this here, how drugs create this state of general anesthesia is not a mystery, because if you ask pretty much most anesthesiologists, they'll go, oh, we don't know how it works. I mean, they want to keep it like a club thing. You know, you have to be part of the brotherhood or the sisterhood in order to really be on the inside. But I can't tell you how it works because they haven't paid attention. That's one of the main points I'm going to make today. And let me just finish with one other practical point before we get into some of the details. What do we actually do? How do we actually induce the state of general anesthesia? So the first thing we would do is give you like an induction of a substantial amount of a drug like propofol to make you unconscious. Then we would start an infusion of propofol or one of the inhaled drugs. The inhaled drugs are ethers. Remember, the first really robust anesthetics that were discovered were ethers. We still use ethers today. And so just a modicum of history, 1846, October 16th, Mass General Hospital, the first public demonstration of anesthesia. We still celebrate Ether Day at Mass General. We all sit around and sniff a little ether. I mean, it's actually your hospital anniversary, but we celebrate it in the fall. So maintain with ether, drugs for pain like opioids. We don't necessarily have to give you anything for amnesia, because if you're taking one of these, the hypnotics refer back to these drugs here, then if you're unconscious, we had a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. This will sound very naive. Ether means something different where I come from. What exactly is ether, and how and when was it discovered?
So I'll just tell you what it is. We'll come back to the how and when, but it was October 16th still, October 16th, 1846. The actual chemical how it was discovered, I can't tell you. But it's used in anesthetics, I can tell you about. It is ether, the chemical structure of ether. That's what's actually used. And the modern day ethers, these drugs here, all they've done is taken that molecule and then just halogenated it, either adding fluorine in the case of sevoflurane, or chlorine and fluorine together in the case of isoflurane, and that's all it is. So it really is just distill the raw.
He's thinking about Maxwell's ether, the vacuum that light, where light propagates. The luminiferous ether. It's not that one. It's the organic chemistry ether.
As you can see, I'm not a mathematical
This is a joker, don't
all right, let's get out of the ether and get back to reality.
Thank you, Steve, but my question was serious.
Really? Okay, all right.
All right, so the other thing is we actually give you drugs to actually relax your muscles. So it makes it easier for the surgeons to work. And we give you drugs to maintain hemodynamic stability, but also respiratory stability. So this is why it's called balanced general anesthesia. You could just use one drug. You could use ether. The downside of that is you have all these side effects. The blood pressure goes down, the heart rate gets depressed, the respiration will be depressed as well. So what you try to do is use small amounts of different drugs. That's why it's called balanced general anesthesia. So I'm going to show you a little video here just to give you a sense of what happens to someone under anesthesia. So in all of our patients, we can use EEG. You can put 4 leads of EEG on the forehead here. And this is I'm going to show you an example of this here. This is a woman I took care of a few years ago. She's 60 years old. She weighs about 80 kilograms. And I'm going to give her a bolus dose of propofol. So propofol is an induction agent. And we're just going to watch what happens to her. And I'll talk you through the video as it plays. All right? So 4 leads. You can see them here. And those are eye blinks if you've never looked at EEG before. So just her doing this, that's the muscle artifact from her blinking her eyes. Now what you're going to see in a second here, what you're going to see in a second is you're going to see like a lot of noise appear. And the reason the noise is going to appear is when you inject propofol into a small vein like the one on the back of my hand, it burns like crazy. So she's going to do this. She's going to tense up. And actually from a pedagogical standpoint, that's actually going to be good for us to make the point, because you're going to see when the drugs take over. So see all this noise that starts here, right here? So it's burning like crazy. And you see the EMG is going up too, the muscle activity. Now watch what happens here in about another 6 or 7 seconds. You can see precisely when the drugs take over. Watch right here, right now. Look at these. Beta oscillations, 12, and now look, large slow oscillations. They get deeper. And now she's going to go into burst suppression. It's going to go flat, and then burst. So flat, and then burst, all right? So she's out. When you saw those large slow oscillations come on, she was out. So let me just talk you through what I just showed you. So this is her awake, and the size of the oscillations matter. So this is 5 microvolts, all right? Then the next stage you saw was here, C, which was the beta oscillations. So if she were coming to me to have like a colonoscopy, then I would have titrated the anesthetic, so I would maintain the state here. So she's just basically sedated. This state is important to understand for another reason. A good number of sleeping medications, if you thought of them as weak anesthetics as opposed to sleeping medications, it would be much more correct. So drugs like Lunesta, midazolam, Ambien, they all work by the same mechanisms that anesthetics work. That is, they enhance GABAergic inhibition. So they themselves can't make you sleep. When you think about what is sleep, sleep is REM, non-REM, REM, non-REM. These drugs can put you in a state of sedation, and the idea then is that maybe your natural sleeping mechanisms will take over. Right? But they would put you here, and then you hope that your sleep states will take over. But that's not, they can't make you have REM and non-REM, so it's important to appreciate. It's one of the biggest boondoggles out there. Right? And this is the state that you would end up in. And then from there, maybe your natural sleeping tendencies would take over. Right? And then we saw her go to here, these large slow oscillations. And I'll just tell you now, whenever you see large slow oscillations, or something is proven otherwise, think of brainstem inactivation. Remember the respiratory centers were in the brainstem? So at that point in time, if you watched her when the large slow oscillations came on, that's when she stopped breathing, all right? Because you're taking out those circuits right on. And there's a very strong correlate with that. And then you start going to burst suppression. And then between the bursts, there's a flat stage here, which is the isometric state. So all of these states here from D down to G are states of coma. You would see people in these states who are in coma because of brain trauma or because of, let's say, an ischemic brain injury. Right? Then here, this is the state I'm going to talk most about. It's a combination of a slow oscillation, which you can see here, so it's something less than 1 cycle per second, and it has a higher frequency oscillation riding on top, 10 cycles per second. You didn't even see this state here. She went right through it, all right? And then there's a final state up here, which is called paradoxical excitation. So it's called paradoxical because actually if you titrate the drug very, very finely, instead of getting calm, the person actually gets quite excited. And if you stay there too long, they can start flailing around and all this sort of thing. And that's why it's called paradoxical, so the drug should inhibit you, but you actually get excited. And then this, you actually have intuition about this, you probably haven't thought about it. So you go to a cocktail party, you get a buzz, right? You drink too much, you get flat. Alcohol is a potent anesthetic. I can tell you that we anesthetize drunks. You need that much drug to actually anesthetize them once they come in drunk. Now, I want to make an important point here. See the size of these 5 microvolts? Down here, these are 20 to 50 microvolts. These are the strongest EEG signals that exist, right? Compared to anything else. Sleep, meditation, diagnosing, coma, what have you. And you saw the reason. once the drugs take effect, there's no noise, right? So these are very, very, and plus, as I'm going to show you, we have large parts of the brain acting in unison. The ironic part about this is we have the strongest EEG signal around. We anesthesiologists, we use it the least, right? You're not obliged to follow someone's brain state under anesthesia. You're obliged to monitor their physiology, heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, but you're not obliged to monitor the brain.
In the traces you showed, there were multiple lines. What were the multiple lines?
So like going back here.
From the patient.
Right, so right here. So what this is these are 4 different leads. So 1, 2, 3, 4.
So in principle, different brain regions.
Well, since these are right here on the forehead, this is probably all just frontal. They're just sitting literally right here. The montages, they used to have a montage where you had like a posterior lead also, but we don't use those anymore. They're pretty much all from the front. And I'm going to show you why that's pretty much sufficient. Question?
And the redundancy is for what reason?
So to tell you the truth, when they built them, right, they actually thought that what they could do is you could see asymmetries. They thought that asymmetries were often happening. And one time that you'll see an asymmetry, like when they do carotid artery surgery, and if you get ischemia, because the carotid artery becomes blocked while the surgeon is operating here, let's say we're operating on the left, you'll actually see the left leads go flat, and the ones on the right continue. And so then what they know to do is we have to increase the blood pressure, or the surgeon has to put in a shunt. They thought that these sorts of things would happen a lot practically, but I can count on one hand the number of times I've actually seen asymmetry in sort of just the standard surgery.
When you said earlier that the person stops breathing when the waves got big, do you really mean like no breathing or just slow breathing?
No, I mean no.
No breathing?
Right, this is why you do not do this at home, Michael Jackson. Seriously. And this is a perfect time to tell you this. So in the Michael Jackson civil trial, I was an expert witness for the family. So I had a chance to read all of the depositions, all the forensic data and what have you. And the bottom line is Michael Jackson died because, first of all, he had somebody giving him anesthesia who shouldn't have given him anesthesia. He wasn't even a cardiologist. It turns out he was an internist. He never passed his boards in cardiology, right? But he'd signed up to pay $100,000 a month to give Michael Jackson anesthesia every night. And he would hook him up to an IV, and he would run propofol into him. And remember the point that I told you about this burning? When they inject, Michael Jackson knew that. In fact, he said, he used to say, "Can you give me my numbing medicine before you give me my milk?" Because propofol is white, it looks like milk. So he unfortunately knew that. He left Michael Jackson in the room. He went to make a phone call to call his girlfriend. And while he was out, Michael Jackson had a respiratory arrest, and they tried to revive him, they couldn't revive him. So even if all the other things he'd done, which he shouldn't have done, he'd given him propofol, he shouldn't be doing that. When we have a patient under anesthesia, we never leave the room. There's always somebody there monitoring because we have to control breathing, heart rate, the physiologic stability that I was talking about. That's the whole state. That's why Michael Jackson died, because someone was taking care of him who was not properly trained. And if you'd asked any anesthesiologist to do this, there's no way in the world they would do that. I mean, no one's going to come to your home and personally anesthetize you. So the way I'm going to show these is in terms of spectrograms. So here's an illustration. So this was a young woman I took care of a few years ago. She was having a small procedure. She just needed anesthesia for about 25, 30 minutes. So here's the time course on this axis here. This is frequency here. And the magnitude of the frequencies are coming out of us in decibels by the color coding. So after induction, she has the large slow oscillations like I showed you before, like right here. And then after that, she breaks into that pattern I mentioned, the one I said the other woman went through, where she has slow oscillations, slow delta oscillations, followed by high frequency. So it looks like this. Right, you can see the high frequency part right here, roughly around 10 hertz. And there's the slow delta part. This is a classic signature for propofol. You give someone who's 18 to 35 propofol, that's the signature you're going to see in the frequency domain. So a large part of what we've done is nothing more than instead of analyzing the data in the time domain, is analyzing the frequency domain where the structure is much more apparent. Right? Now, here, I want to show you one other bit of phenomenology, then we'll talk mechanism. So this is from an experiment. We have people who volunteer to let us anesthetize them. So if you're not doing anything next Saturday, stop by. We're all recruiting subjects. Yeah. So for these studies, we have 64 leads of EEG. So this is whole head now. This is going to be whole head, all right? And so this is a gentleman who has 64 leads on. These are 44 of the 64 leads. And I have to tell you about a little bit of physiology. If you put electrodes in the back of the skull, the scalp right here, in the occipital area, and you close your eyes like this, you'll generate what's called an eyes closed alpha oscillation. A 10 cycles per second oscillation is very, very regular. Pretty much everybody has it. Might get a little weaker as we get older, but it's reliably there. And that's what this gentleman is doing. So we're computing a spectrogram at 44 locations on his head. His nose is up here, his left ear is right here. And these are those two sites right here on the left and right occipital regions. So 10, 20, 30, 10, 20, 30. He's in an eyes closed alpha oscillation. Now, the phenomenon I'm going to show you is called interiorization. When you give someone propofol, the GABAergic drugs like I was talking about, this oscillation moves from the back of the head, concentrates in the front. As long as you keep the propofol running, it'll stay in the front, and then it'll move backwards when you turn the drug off, right? So not only is there a temporal dynamic like this, there's a very rich spatial dynamic across the head, and this is an easy one to see. So what we're going to do is give him increasing doses of propofol, starting here, and we're going to go up to 5 different levels. Each level is about 14 minutes, 70 minutes to get up, and about another 60 or 70 minutes to come down. So I'm just going to play this. So no drug yet. You'll see that it'll say level 1 when the drug starts. So it just started. Now watch how this breaks up here.
Wow.
See, it appears in the front. So this is just level 2. See, now it really comes on. Very intense. Level 3. See, it's all disappeared back here. And the pattern is the same going from here forward, from the center of the head to the front. Now this is level 5. Now watch what happens when we turn the drug off and let it wear off. It moves backwards. And then he comes to right over here at about level 8. All right?
So the visual cortex is quite active.
Oh, it's very, well, when he was anesthetized, it went to slow oscillations. It was actually quite inactive. Right? And now this is that occipital alpha oscillation again.
Are there long-term risks to volunteers who do this?
Not in our hands. A certain doctor took care of Michael Jackson. Yes, they're demonstrated risks, right? But not in our hands.
But I mean, if you do it repeatedly too often, as far as you know,
It's a good question. I mean, so it's something that people have developed concerns about it for kids who need repeated anesthetics. And then the difficulty is so what has been shown now, I think the field accepts, is that kids who need anesthesia for short periods of time, there's really no risk. Kids who have to have repeated anesthetics, the difficulty is they're usually very sick. They have to have the therapies like they need their repeated chemotherapies or these sorts of things. So we're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, which is one of the reasons why one of the things that the last part of the talk hints at is after a certain point, it really doesn't matter what the current drugs do. We have to come up with better ways of doing this. We have to get the neuroscience straight so we can do that. So I can draw a diagram like this. I can do this before we did any sort of research in experiments or what have you. And the one thing I just want to point out here, this is a cortical interneuron. And it's synapsing onto an excitatory pyramidal neuron. So these guys are inhibitory, these guys are excitatory. And when you give propofol, it enhances the ability of the interneurons to inhibit. All right? These guys are everywhere. They're here, they're down here in the brainstem, they're here in the thalamus. So anywhere they are, propofol is going to act on them. So they're going to enhance inhibition.
Sure, reminds us where the nose is.
Oh, yeah. So your nose. So this is the front of your head right here. So your nose would be basically down here. So this is your brainstem. So I'm looking at the part of the brain that's roughly here. All right, just to get the anatomy right. And again, this is a setup for propofol. You see this point right here where it says POA? POA stands for preoptic area. And what the preoptic area is, it's an area which comes out of the preoptic area of the hypothalamus. It's like my wrist here, right? And my fingers are like those projections. Those projections hit each one of the major arousal centers. These synapses here, these connections, are GABAergic. So when propofol gets here, it binds, and that's exactly when you saw the slow oscillations here. When they hit here, lower down, that's when you saw her stop breathing. Right? So you can trace back exactly what's happening and make an inference about what's going on. So the idea that we don't know how anesthesia works makes no sense. So I go to the OR and I see a pattern like this. All right? I do a study and I see this pattern here of the alpha oscillations concentrating in the front of the head. And then the one thing that I want to point out is, I didn't say this a second ago, this alpha oscillation in the front of the head across all these sites is coherent. And I mean it in a technical sense, that what I put up here on the board, I don't know if you can see it, but if you take the cross-spectral matrix at 10 hertz, right, and you take it and you find there's 64 of them, so you find 64 inches, it's 64 by 64, so you take the largest eigenvalue, the ratio of that to the sum of the eigenvalues. That ratio is 0.8 to 0.9. So that means there's one major direction where all this is occurring. And that one major direction is in the front of the head. All right, so here's where the modeling came in. With Nancy's help, just sharing with her these factoids, we reasoned that what had to happen was that the most likely thing that was going on was an oscillation. The alpha oscillation, the 10 hertz oscillation, is being created by the thalamus and the cortex. You have this cycle that's going back and forth because it's so focused and it's so intense. And in fact, it's very consistent with the physiology, and that's what the modeling helped us understand. And then what we did was we actually did experiments where in rodents, where we stuck an electrode here and an electrode there and measured it. And then in addition, we did it in non-human primates. So we feel very comfortable this is where the 10 hertz oscillation sits. But the practical implication is, what does it do to you? So this 10 hertz oscillation, we feel, is tying up the thalamus and making it very, very difficult for it to communicate with other parts of the brain, therefore contributing to the patient being unconscious. All right? So, but let me show you what I consider, I was telling Steve this earlier today, what I consider to be the most compelling information we have about why a human might be unconscious under a drug like propofol. And so, I'm sure you have it here at your hospital, but we have a number of patients who have intractable epilepsy, and they come for surgery. They failed medical therapy, so they're going to get surgical therapy. So to figure out where the focus is, or the foci are, they get electrodes implanted. So they come to the operating room, the surgeon implants electrodes, kind of guesstimating where the epileptic focus is. So they'll put in microelectrodes like this, and sometimes they'll even let us put in quick electrodes for research purposes. Right? So then what happens is, we wake them up, they stay in hospital for 5 to 7 days, off of medications, and then they come back to the operating room to have the epileptic focus removed, and then eventually have the grids removed, the strips and the electrodes removed, and then have resection of the epileptic focus. All right? So when they come back to the operating room the second time, you have a human that has electrodes in the brain, so you can see what human neurons are doing under anesthesia. It's a natural experiment. And that was, you can't see it down here, but that was Laura's PhD thesis, Laura Lewis's PhD thesis.
What are the depths of those?
So these right here are just basically right on the cortex, right? So they'll actually just put they'll put the grid just on top like this. And then these are just, these microelectrodes are just passed in just a few millimeters. But it's enough to record from the superficial layer of the cortex. And so this is an illustration of it. So awake, this is spiking activity. These are the field potentials. And they correspond to these colors here. So this is when the patient was conscious. Then over here is when the patient is unconscious. So here are those large slow oscillations that were occurring we saw before, and now they're occurring at, here's the one at the red side, here's the one at the blue side, here's the one at the green side. And the key point that I want to make is the following. This is a neuron whose activity is recorded next to this red site. When the patient was awake, the neuron could spike pretty much wherever it wanted to. Now, when the slow oscillations appear, the neuron is only spiking now. It's like every 2 seconds or so. So the same thing is happening. So this neuron here is next to the red electrode, and if I looked at a neuron here that was next to the green electrode, I would see the same thing, but at a different phase. So the neurons are spiking like this. Right? So the slow oscillation is associated with this fragmenting, or if you were dephasing, of the cortex. So if you, in other words, for us to communicate, if we need to be able to send spikes between us within some reasonably small time frame, let's say 10 milliseconds, 5 milliseconds, or something like that, this is going to be very hard to do if this is happening all over your cortex. Right? So this is probably one of the most compelling reasons that the drugs are making you unconscious. All right, so why do we care? All right. So you go to a cocktail party, right, and you talk about anesthesia for sure, right? Anesthesia is really cool. Those guys are amazing. Sort of, you don't talk about it. The only time you talk about anesthesia is if we screw up. And you get an article in the New Yorker that says, oh, after 175 years, these guys still can't tell whether somebody's unconscious or not, right? Because here's another example of awareness under anesthesia. First of all, let me just make a point. Awareness under anesthesia is not a public health menace, right? It happens 1 in every 20,000 cases, first thing. The reason it's still an issue when it shouldn't be in 2019 is that anesthesiologists don't monitor, right? They've been used to doing it as a black box all along, and they don't monitor. So if someone came to me and said, Emery, the last time I had surgery, I had awareness, I'd say, look, it's not going to happen this time. I'd put on the EEG, I use it on all my patients, I'd dial them down until I saw this or something comparable, and I could assure them, if anything that I've said, if this is even partially correct, what I said about the slow oscillation is partially correct, I can be pretty sure they're not going to have awareness. And what we've estimated, just based on talking to people across the country, and even in our own hospital, where we have a training program to teach people how to use the EEG, and it's available in every OR, only 20% of anesthesiologists use it. Right? So that's a problem. And the real difficulty that arises because we're trained as pharmacologists, physiologists, but not as neuroscientists. Right? So here's the point. The different drugs have different signatures. If you look at it this way, right, maybe you can see the differences, but as soon as you take the spectrogram, the differences become readily apparent. And these two drugs they work very similarly, so it's not surprising that they have a similar pattern. And the ethers have this additional oscillation here, the origin of which we still don't understand what we're working on. And this is ketamine, just like, and this is at a dose, right, where someone would be hallucinating, right? With this, it has a 30 hertz oscillation, which is very, very reproducible. And this is dexmedetomidine, this is high dose dexmedetomidine. You see the very, very large, like slow oscillation. And I just put this in here to say that just like we took a deep dive with propofol, we can take a deep dive with each one of the drugs. We can go into great length, explain at great lengths how this anatomy matches up with the oscillations, both because of experiments, but also because of the model. And this is just to reemphasize the relationship between general anesthesia and sleep. So again, if you take nothing away from this lecture, realize that general anesthesia is not sleep. Right? So here is, that was somebody awake. That eyes closed, awake alpha oscillation that we showed, the occipital alpha oscillation. These are the states of general anesthesia. Under general anesthesia, we give you drugs, we bring you down, and we hold you in a state like here, for example. Sleep is going between, so non-REM, REM, non-REM, REM. 4 to 6 times a night, every 90 minutes. It's nothing like sleep. There's no way in the world Michael Jackson was going to sleep with propofol. In fact, I'll just share another little factoid with you about this whole case. So Chuck Sizer and I, who's a very well-known sleep expert that Steve mentioned earlier, that we did our circadian rhythms research with, we worked together on this case, and he analyzed like the sleep information. And what he figured out was that Michael Jackson was probably sleep deprived for 2 months because every night he was getting propofol. And now that you see, his brain wasn't doing this, right? It was getting to one of these states and probably just staying there, maybe perhaps flirting with the sleep states, but I'm reasonably certain that he wasn't getting sleep like this. Interestingly enough, some people were fooled by this because he'd wake up in the morning and he was feeling good. And they interpreted that as restorative sleep. What was happening is propofol induces the release of dopamine. So you feel good. In fact, people tell us that all the time after colonoscopy. They'll go, wow, that was the best sleep I ever had. What did you give me? Can I take some home with me? I'll be back next week, right? And you never hear people say they'll be back next week for a colonoscopy, I can assure you, right? But once they've had the propofol, there's that feel. So that's what was occurring. And then consistent with that was when they commented on how he was performing at that time, he was having trouble getting his dance steps down. He was forgetting the words to songs that he'd known for years and this sort of thing. So he was basically killing himself. So at some point, the amount of, no matter what amount of propofol he got, he would probably just kill himself because of sleep deprivation.
Confused about one thing there. You pointed to the 10 hertz oscillation, but when you were looking at the neurons, you had something that was half a hertz. There was
The very large slow oscillations.
every 2 seconds.
Right.
Where's that in this?
So that's more in here. That's in here. So what's happening is we recorded that. So the size of the site on the brain matters. The slow oscillation I was showing you were back here. And remember, this is like more from the front of the head, where you have the alpha and the slow. So that's why you just saw the pure slow oscillations, because they're recorded in the medial temporal lobe.
So, but that happens under ordinary anesthesia, even though it's labeled vegetative state coma here.
Oh no, so what's happening here is, you can't see it down here. This is from our article, which is called General Anesthesia, Sleep and Coma. And the purpose of this was to sort of say that these states that you see here under anesthesia are exactly the same states you see under coma.
Okay.
So this is, I can blame it on the slide being cut off. But that's the title of the article, General Anesthesia, Sleep and Coma. Right? And so I just want to show you one thing of what happens with aging. So here's someone who's 30, all right? So slow alpha oscillation, 0 to 4 hertz oscillation, right? So there's someone who's 57, okay? You know, this guy could be this guy's dad. So if you look here, 10 hertz oscillation, slow delta oscillation. And I'll just point out something because it's not artifactual, it's actually real. You see how this band here is roughly going from about 10 to about, let's say, about 17 or so? And this one is a bit lower, let's say it goes from 8 to 12. That's real, right? The band not only decrease in amplitude, but they change in sort of location, right? Now here's someone who's 81, all right? So this is a woman I took care of about 7 years ago who had a tumor on her chest the size of an American football. It took the thoracic surgeons the better part of 6.5 hours to take it off. And you can see the alpha oscillation there, it's really weak. You can see the slow delta oscillation there. But one of the things that's really important to appreciate is there's nothing up here. This is on the dB scale. I was able to give her 1/3 of the already age-adjusted dose of propofol because I was monitoring EEG. Just to give you some idea, it would be recommended that she would get like 100 micrograms per kilogram per minute. I was giving her 30. Because I could see that her EEG said she was unconscious. I didn't need to give her more. If we'd given her the 30, the 100, like we were supposed to by what's recommended, she would have been flat the whole time, right? So this is why using EEG is so important. Now this is the part that's a little bit sobering. You see these two guys are roughly the same age. His EEG looks like his EEG looks like hers, right? So when you first see this, you're like, well, that's interesting. What's up? We age different physically. You know, maybe our brains age differently also, and that's not surprising. It makes a lot of sense. The thing is, I never would have thought of this, but now it's, again, obvious in retrospect. Anesthesia may bring it out because think of anesthesia not as something to put you in a state so you can have surgery. Think of it as a stimulus. So you put in a stimulus, and what the drug should do, it makes your brain oscillate. So when you're young, you know, it oscillates like this. And as you get older, you know, it oscillates like this with lower and lower amplitude. And that's not because you don't have to invoke anything about dementia or anything like that. If you just take a neuron and you look at its anatomy, as we get older, the myelin sheath breaks down, the dendrites don't extend and retract as much, we don't release as much neurotransmitter, cell volume declines. So each of these neurons here has been around and working for like 81 years. And so, maybe one of the things that we could do is use this as a way to diagnose brain age. For example, when...
So is this a football player?
That's very interesting you should ask that. I don't think so. But I just had a conversation with this research group that's collecting data on football players who finished playing, who've agreed to be part of a monitoring study for CTE. And they've asked me if I want to just give them 20 minutes of anesthesia to see what their brains look like. And I think we're going to do it. Because I'm willing to bet that there's some differences. And I've seen them. Like I had a gentleman who was 30 years old. And so he's about to have like appendectomy or something like that. And I was talking to him. And something didn't quite seem right. I couldn't put my finger on it. And I always ask people about doing exercise or this sort of thing. And he says, yeah, I go to the gym, but I used to play rugby. Right? He was 30. He looked like that. Right? Now that's obviously that's anecdotal, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Question.
So some of my patients will refuse surgery at 70 plus because they say, I don't want too much anesthesia. It's like, well, you can go blind or do surgery. What are your thoughts on dementia and these claims that patients make?
So they're very real. I mean, and we, once we've had like our anesthesia colleagues, telling us like they actually, the guy who ran our neuro monitoring service had anesthesia. Said, at Emery, like I couldn't find words for like 2 weeks, right? I really had difficulty. It's real. It's very, very real. In fact, I had a gentleman who was 89. Whoops. Yeah. Okay, I can say that. He was 89. Anybody who's older than 89, you can't say their age. HIPAA, right? But he was 89. And former attorney, sharp as a tack, he goes, I don't want general anesthesia, I want you to do a spinal one. He was having one. So the best thing that I can do now is I monitor, right? I really give them just exactly what they need. I titrate it as carefully as possible. And if I could have one more thing, it's what we're going to do and talk about at the end, I would give them something to turn the brain back on. To actually help wake them up. And I think that would make a huge difference. But it's true. It's not fictitious. So here are the kids. So there's a 3-year-old, there's a 14-year-old, right? They're just, you can see the power change, like basically, like over time, right? And so there's real physiology going on here. You can discover it essentially under anesthesia. This wouldn't be obvious otherwise.
May I add something about that?
Yes, sir.
So, had a daughter who had to have some wisdom teeth removed, and I don't think it would be general. I think it was some kind of laughing gas or something.
Nitrous oxide.
Yeah. So, and she was so delirious and silly and really enjoying it afterward. And it seemed like she was faking. But should I infer from all this power at those frequencies that maybe she's really quite delirious?
No. What was happening? She was probably delirious.
Yeah.
But if it was nitrous oxide, it wasn't that.
No.
That wasn't the pattern.
Okay.
The pattern of nitrous oxide, Alice and I were talking about this earlier today. It's like unreal. It's like totally unreal. Nitrous oxide looks like perfect sine waves. It's like amazing. I'll show you. I have a picture that I can show you.
Steve, that's actually safe. We did it in college all the time.
Right. Yeah. But once I saw that, it was very apparent to me. Like, sniffing something like this, like glue or these sorts of things, could also kill you. Because, again, remember what I said, anytime you see like a large sine wave like this, think that the brainstem is largely inactivated. Wow. Right? So that's why, even though she's like silly and stuff, someone should be there with her, make sure she's still breathing, these sorts of things. Because so it's very real. So let's talk about medical coma. All right, because I want to talk a bit about control. So these are 3 very well-known people who had head injuries, all right? And so they were placed in a state of medical coma. So you actually know what a medical coma is now. Medical coma just means you give them propofol until you see burst suppression here on the EEG. So flat burst, and you hold them in this state for 48 hours, sometimes a week. Actually, I think Michael Schumacher was in a medical coma for months. All right?
What was he?
So he's a racing car driver.
He's a race car driver.
But it was from a ski accident.
Okay.
All right? And so think about this. You're going to be in the same state for weeks, or let's say several days. And the way it's done is done manually. You just set the infusion rate, kind of watch the EEG. The nurse goes and takes care of another patient, comes back a little while later, goes a little bit too much, turn it down.
They're not using an inhalant at the same time?
No, this is done IV. It's easier because with the inhalant, well, the person is clearly intubated also, so you can do that. Some people actually do that, but this is usually done with IV drugs. So the big point that I want to make is we should do this with a controller. We should build a control system for this because we're going to be in the same state for several hours. So we got some rat volunteers to come over. Let us do this with them, all right? So here's the EEG signal, all right? And we just have to define a target. So the target is easy to define here. It's the fraction of time that the animal stays suppressed in a minute. So you can have a number between 0 to 1, right? So the fraction of time that it's suppressed, in suppressed state. So you set that target, and that starts an infusion rate, and you read the EEG in real time, and you estimate how suppressed the animal is. You take a difference between where you target it to be and where the animal actually is, and you control the infusion rate on a second basis, all right? So let me just show you this. So we set the target at 0.4, so 40% suppressed. Here's the pump changing the infusion on a second basis. And then up here is the raw EEG, right? And this is what the controller is actually doing relative to where the target is. Now what we're going to do is say take that to 0.7, so you need to make it 70% suppressed. So the dynamics of the pump change in order to achieve that. And you see how this is getting a little bit lower here because now there's more suppression. Right? So this is actually falling pretty good, actually. Right? And the time scale here is actually minutes. And now we go up to 0.9, so 90% suppressed. And you see this drops down even further. So it's here, there, there. So most of the time it's suppressed. And you can see that it's pretty much on target. So the pump dynamics are different. All right? So what I showed you is this animal here, right? Animal 1 going up like that. If you want to come down, we don't have a drug that will decrease the burst suppression. What the controller does is it turns off the pump, right? You drift down, so it's like a jet taking off. It's a glider to come down. And once you reach the level you are, it re-engages and essentially takes over. So these are just, 6 animals, a whole different range of control options, and this works really well. So we're applying for FDA approval now to try this in the ICU at Mass General. Right? And I just want to say one other thing about burst suppression here. So this is burst suppression, just showing it to you. And this is a model that Shenung Cheng worked out. We published in 2012. And so here's the burst and here's the suppression. And the main idea behind it was that it had this metabolic limit. Shenung postulated that what was happening was you would be bursting as long as you could, but you had some sort of metabolic limit. And so you'd use up all your energy, which you represented as ATP. And then once that happened, you would stop bursting. And then over time, during suppression, it builds up again, you reach a threshold, and you start again. So you have this going on. So that was his postulate. And so he actually called this ATP, and this phenomenon, this part here, he called the change in conductance, all right? So this is a theoretical model. So we got David Boaz at the Imaging Center at MGH to help us look at this. And so right here, see the gray lines? The gray lines are the burst suppression. This is actual burst suppression in a rat. The red line is oxyhemoglobin, and the blue line is deoxyhemoglobin. Okay? So the red line represents energy, and the blue line represents this ATP. I would never have known what to even think about, like the ATP conductance. So this is all predicted, right? And here, I mean, to me, this is one of the best matchups I've ever seen between something that's totally predicted and then going and doing an experiment. So this is thanks to David Boaz at MGH. You can't see the bottom here, it's cut off. This says oxyhemoglobin for the red and deoxyhemoglobin for the blue. So we're grateful to David Boaz for doing these experiments for us. So this is one illustration where taking the modeling very seriously actually gave us some insights that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
What was that done on?
Pardon me?
What was
These
that?
are rats. Right. These are rats. And the anesthetic is isoflurane.
The model is just this little phase plane model.
Yeah, that's it.
Variable, nonlinear. It's like something that could be in somebody's textbook.
How about yours? And the picture would be great, right?
Yeah.
Or even a popular book.
Fantastic.
So the hemoglobin was a surrogate to the ATP.
It's a surrogate to the ATP.
How did they measure the
Oh, this
continuous
so
hemoglobin?
it's NIRS, so near infrared spectroscopy. So it's just like doing pulse oximetry, right? Because oxy, deoxy, hemoglobin absorb at different wavelengths, so you can calculate from the total hemoglobin what's oxy and what's deoxy. All right. So we don't wake you up after anesthesia. We just let the drugs wear off. And so the New York Times did a piece on our laboratory about 8 years ago, and this is one of the letters to the editor. It said, I had my first directive surgery without paralysis in 1949, billed for the anesthesiologist $400. My mother was horrified, but my father calmed her when he said it was probably $50 for the procedure, but I gladly paid $350 because he knew how to wake her up, right? I mean, again, cocktail party. I go to the cocktail party and go, you're an anesthesiologist, you knock people out, right? I go, oh. No. Any fool can knock you out. I bring you back, right? This is the key thing, right? So after the rats finished one experiment, we have them come and do another one here. So this is an anesthetized rat here. He's not sleeping, he's anesthetized. And he's been on isoflurane for like the last 20 minutes. And what we're going to do is inject intravenous Ritalin. Right, the same Ritalin that's used to treat ADHD. All right? So this is Ken Saul, my colleague. And so now he flushes it in. Now watch what happens. We didn't turn the anesthetic off, right? He's still getting the anesthesia. See, he has to turn over for this to count. It doesn't count from our standpoint unless he turns over. All right, he's still going at it. He has his feet caught in the wires there, so he's having trouble.
Yeah.
He does make it. I've seen the end of the video.
Is he partially awake, you're saying? Or
Yeah, he is.
Okay.
But that's a good question. That's a very good question.
Or is
How
he
awake
just-
is he?
Yeah.
All right.
There you go.
So I'm glad you asked that. So Ken did another study, right? So he has another rat who he's actually trained him to execute a task. He's trained to go here, hit a light. If he hits the correct light, he can turn around here and go to food room. So he's trained on that. Then he's anesthetized. And then we do the same thing. We wake him up, but this time instead of giving him Ritalin to wake him up, we stimulate his ventral tegmental area in his brain to wake him up. And we leave the isoflurane on, all right? So he's awake because we're stimulating his brain, all right? In the setting of the anesthesia. So he's going to go and start with Then what we're going to do is we're going to turn the stimulation off. He's going to go out again. So this is going to answer your question. Can he function? So the stimulation is off. Ken turns on the stimulation at 40 hertz. And he comes to. He looks for the food first, but there's no free lunch, not even here. Right? So he turns around, hits the light, right? Gets a food report. So that's the correct light. So he turns around again, checks them out, hits the correct one, right? He's wobbly, but he's functioning, right? He's not, you know.
Will he remember it?
I'll have to ask him.
Do you have any way of knowing?
Oh, you're wrong one.
He hits the wrong light. He hit the wrong one there, and now he turns around. Now watch what happens. Ken is going to turn off the stimulation now, right? He's going to turn off the stimulation. And he's back out. The only reason he was awake was because we were turning his brain back on. And what's happening here is the following. When you give Ritalin, it blocks the reuptake of dopamine, an excitatory neurotransmitter. And it's very important for cognition, for being able to think and be sharp. And you know, people often self-administer Ritalin who are in stress jobs or these sorts of things, working on Wall Street. In fact, they take it every day because they feel like they can't be on their game unless they're taking their Ritalin. That is dumb. Do not do that. That is dangerous, right? But they do it. And so we were just stimulating this part of the brain directly here with electrical stimulation. We've also done it optogenetically to show that you can do this with very specific hitting dopamine neurons in particular. So this is one thing that I want to do. We're doing clinical trials on this now as a way to improve cognitive function in patients after surgery. So this would be the other thing I want to do. All right. So this is what I've told you. The brain under anesthesia is not turned off. It's actually quite dynamic. I've shown you why the oscillations might be a way of reducing these altered states of arousal. I've shown how you can probably monitor them very easily using EEG, that they change with the anesthetic, the age of the patient, and that not only can we use it to monitor, but maybe even develop control strategies. I've just shown you a little bit of something about turning the brain back on. This might be a way of reducing brain dysfunction after anesthesia. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Electro-optogeneric stimulation, are you referring to like a small sine wave with a 0 to 3 volts applying to that area?
No, what it is it's just it's actually either electrical or optogenetic. So we've done both, and we've recorded both. So the optogenetic state is just really just turning on the laser, leaving it on continuously, and just turning it off basically. And I don't remember what the frequency was on the electrical state. I have to look it up.
But the laser's shining in the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's into the down into the so you can actually. It's a little bit of work, but you can insert the probe, basically down into the VTA. Yeah. Very easy. Question?
Deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease is based upon looking at thalamocortical cortical oscillations to help understand.
Or the subthalamic influence.
And how similar are the oscillations that you see there and the kinds of oscillations that
They're actually quite different. You know, like these oscillations here, I can't overemphasize how large the oscillations under anesthesia are. They are really enormous. And just to give you some idea, so this would be like an oscillation in slow wave state. Okay? This would be a slow oscillation like from dexmedetomidine, one of the presidents shown. This is a slow oscillation from like propofol. It really is quite dramatically different. And it is because we think that you're getting, and we have evidence for this now. We've kind of looked at it in monkeys where we're able to put electrodes at 6 sites simultaneously across the brain. You get large parts of the brain to act in unison. And so you get this summing of effects, or however you want to call it, to produce these large oscillations. So they're actually quite different. And the other thing which really matters is their temporal structure, how coupled they are. The slow oscillations, like from propofol, are not coupled at all. The slow oscillations, for example, like the dexmedetomidine, are actually coupled, so that someone is arousable under dexmedetomidine, but they're not arousable under propofol. So they vary quite a bit. Question?
What about hypnosis? What does that look like?
Oh, that's a good question. So we actually did that. We had a hypnotist come to the laboratory, hypnotize some folks, and we knew he was good because he worked on a cruise ship. No, I mean you have to pick people you can hypnotize, or your act is like blown, right? You can't hop off the ship, right? Right. So he hypnotized folks, and it actually looks like an awake EEG.
Okay.
It doesn't look like a slow EEG at all. And all the people that he hypnotized had the same sort of feeling. They all said at any time they felt like what they could do was stop doing what he asked them to do, but they decided not to. And it makes sense that it should look like a normal EEG, because what's happening is it's the cortex getting the rest of the body to do what it's supposed to, to obey the command, right? So it is top-down control. You're hearing a command and you're acting on that command, from the cognitive centers you have now. So it makes sense that it looks like a normal EEG. Question?
Yeah, for nitrous oxide with a long cycle oscillation, you said that was indicative of depressing brainstem activity. Why then is there not more instances of problems with people coming out of nitrous oxide induced, anesthetic?
That's a good question. So one of the reasons is that this state that I'm talking about here turns out to be transient with the large slow oscillations. It lasts for between 3 to about 12 minutes. And then you go into like a higher frequency oscillation. It sort of looks like that. And so my conjecture is, the only thing, what I was pointing out here is, because this state exists, that exists at a time when the person's probably really, really vulnerable, where the brainstem is probably substantially at risk for being shut down, and you might want to be careful there if you saw that. And we've tracked this. When I first learned about this, we went back into our database of cases, and we found 19 cases. And it was so interesting, we wrote about it back in 2015, right? So I think what happens here is, this is probably less effective than the brainstem. And I don't know why it transitioned. That's an open question for us. I don't know why that happens. But I think if you're in this state here, you're probably just in the sedative state, and you're probably less at risk for having like a respiratory arrest. Just conjecture. Question?
You mentioned that hypnotics like Ambien are sort of like general anesthesia in a way?
Weak anesthetics.
A weak anesthetic.
Right.
Okay. So the question is, are people really getting sleep on Ambien?
No,
Okay.
that's it.
Really? Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you may have to take me out in bodyguards tonight. the companies here that I'm saying this, but what these drugs, people will tell you to take Ambien. They say, like, I know I was asleep, but I don't feel rested. Right? That's a common statement with Ambien. In a certain fraction of people who take Ambien, they actually get hyper. They actually get a stimulatory effect. It's just logic. The drugs have the same mechanism of action as propofol. They're just not as potent. And if you look at the EEG under them, they produce beta oscillations, and then you'll start to see the sleep oscillations appear, but it's not because they're causing them, it's because your sleep centers are starting to work. Maybe with reduced anxiety or something like that. But remember, those drugs can't make you do this. They can't make you do normal non-REM cycle. So once you put it together, it's just misleading. It's like totally misleading.
So if I'm hearing it right, we haven't actually found something that induces sleep per se, the sleep cycling. Other than, your body can do it. If you wanted to, like it sounds like you're saying the mechanism for Ambien and related is that they remove whatever.
They're sedatives.
Yeah, whatever it is that's making you not use your sleep cycle.
Right.
That's being somehow suppressed, and so now sleep is taking over.
Right.
But if you actually wanted to produce sleep, it sounds like we don't know how to do that yet.
We don't. That's an open question. That's a very open
That's so
question.
amazing.
Yeah, that's a very open question.
Can you control it to get you into the site?
Well, at the moment, based on what's available in the market, nothing does that.
Yeah.
None of the sleep medications do that. And we were talking about melatonin the other night. I don't know how melatonin works. I mean, I've asked my sleep friends how it works. They haven't been able to give me a good story. And we also talked about, like, Benadryl, for example. I don't have financial interest in Benadryl or anything like that, but I'll just tell you personally what I've taken when I've had trouble spending Benadryl, right? Because at least I have an insight how that works. And so again, just the spirit.
Because you said to solve that histamine.
Right, because it blocks histamine, as I understand it. And histamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, so I have a good idea of what I'm doing myself when I'm administering, when I'm taking like Benadryl, all right? So, but nothing can make you do this, right? Nothing on the market can make you do that. And if they say, I'd love somebody to say that was the case. Oh my God. There's like no, that's just not possible. That's too much. Question?
Just to follow up with that thought about sleep aids or prescription sleep pills, given that they're not actually doing maybe what they're advertising, in that they're inducing sleep like in a deterministic way, how does that factor into the dependence and the what's the word when you take something and then it stops
Addiction?
working? Sorry?
Addiction?
Not addiction, but like you take something and then it stops being effective.
The tachyphylaxis, yeah, or the, yeah.
Yeah, how does that relate to the story you were just saying about how, sleep and anesthesia aren't the same state?
Well, I mean, the correct answer for me is I honestly don't know, but I think that what may happen is as people start to see that they're not getting the effect they want, they go, I'll take 2 this time, or maybe I'll try a third one, right? And then now you're starting to move into a realm where you're giving like hypertherapeutic doses, which start to be very, very close to like the limits of what you're supposed to take. And in those cases, it just gets to be anybody's game, anybody's guess. But you can imagine these people don't wake up. They don't wake up and go, ah. I mean, we all know that feeling you have when you're refreshed after a good night's sleep. Those drugs don't produce that. And taking more is not really the answer. You really need something that mechanistically reduces the oscillation between REM and non-REM sleep. Question?
So, I know you can't ask a rat when they wake up, did you remember that? But have you looked at memory? Maybe, I'm wondering if there's any relationship between people who happen to remember their anesthesia and those who don't. Like, if we're not paying attention to the EEG, then maybe there are people who did wake up and don't remember it. And so maybe it's not so much about consciousness, it's more about memory.
Right. No, that's a good question. And so to be fair, there is the state now which the neurologists are talking about, which is called unconscious wakefulness. And the idea that, you're doing things which are, conscious-like, you've kind of come to, but you're not entirely awake in the truly awake sense, right? So I think those states exist, and I think if you give people like small doses of anesthetics, you can play around and get people into those states. That's forbidden. However, if we think about just the very basic problem, I want to anesthetize you, and I don't want you to have consciousness, right? So there, in all these cases, right, in literally all of these cases where they've had this awareness, people did not have an EEG on, and they're not using EEG just like like we've been suggesting. And in particular, what they've done here, I'll just show you. We've actually set up. We'll go back here. Oh, you won't be able to see it. It's cut off. It's a bummer. Oh, yeah, it's totally cut off. We have a website where there's free CME to teach anesthesiologists how to use the EEG. Now, even though we have this free website, we can teach people how to do this. The biggest impediment is you need the monitors that actually do the spectrogram and these things like in real time. And so that's an issue which we're addressing also. I mean, you have to create a new product for people to be able to do this. But to solve that basic problem, there are ways of doing that, and people are not using the EEG in that case. And that's not a subtle thing, is what I'm suggesting. Particularly when most people are probably overdosed with anesthetics. That's probably one of the reasons they overdose them, is because they want to err on the side of giving too much. And then every now and then, they give a little bit too little, and they can't tell that because they're not reading the EEG. There's somebody there who needed a lot more than you thought, legitimately. And so that person has awareness. So I would just explore those basic cases before, like something like unconscious wakefulness, which does exist. There's no question about that. That's well documented.
This may be just personal to me, but I did have an experience with a colonoscopy, and I'm probably long overdue for another one, which I've been deferring. And a more recent experience with general anesthesia for some laparoscopic surgery. And my perception of the two was very different. For the colonoscopy, the most striking thing to me was I closed my eyes and opened them, and I had no sense
No time had passed.
Yes.
Right.
So this isn't just me. Whereas for the laparoscopic surgery, I had no memories, but I didn't have that perception of no time passing. What's going on there?
So The short answer is, I don't know the reason, but the first case that you cite is what most people talk about. Anesthesia gives you the sense like no time has passed. You get anesthesia, you wake up and you go, have you guys done the operation yet? And it's like, dude, we've been done for the last 20 minutes, you're in the recovery room now. Like, oh, wow. And to tell you the truth, I've actually been talking to some of my, one of my colleagues who studies time perception to see if there's any way we could actually study this. It would be fascinating to understand, because it seems like a very unique type of amnesia, right? There's no sense of time passage whatsoever. So the short answer is I don't know.
Are the EEG electrodes similar to EKG electrodes, and if so, is it possible to just create a device that has a two-dimensional live spectrometer with what you're transforming in it, take the time signal and watch it live, and now you've got a portable device in every operating room to make it easier to monitor those anesthetics?
Yeah, so we have a startup that's working on that. The company's called Untitled. Full disclosure, we're working on exactly that. So hopefully next year when I come back to talk, we'll be out there on the market. But we're actually working on it, because the bottom line is nobody wants to do it. And the biggest impediment is even if you have the education materials out there, if they can't go to the OR with something that actually reduces the spectrogram like we're suggesting,
Two pros,
two would be enough. Because I can tell you, the question was asked about the asymmetry before. The times I've seen asymmetry has been, there were really 2 times that I've actually seen it. And I think it was then just because of the head placement. So it would be totally plausible.
Maybe we'll just let's just take one more question. Go ahead, sleepwalking.
All right, so the sleepwalking occurs. You do most of your dreaming during non-REM sleep. So you most of your dreaming during REM sleep, right? Sleepwalking occurs during non-REM sleep because you can dream also during non-REM sleep as well. It's much harder to sleepwalk during REM sleep because the way to think about REM sleep is active brain but paralyzed body. You've probably seen the dogs on YouTube. They're sort of doing this. They're dreaming about catching a rabbit, but they can't move because their bodies are paralyzed. So when people are actually sleepwalking, they're in non-REM stage 2, non-REM stage 2 or 3 sleep. So that's when it's actually occurring. Because then you have control of your body. You can act on your dreams. We think that what REM sleep is doing, based on studies in rodents, many of which have been done by Matt Wilson at MIT, is that it's a time when you're consolidating memories, right? Replaying things that you've learned, maybe pruning information, and then roughly speaking, this is a bit of hand waving. Slow wave sleep is there for your brain to actually rest. So you go back and forth between these 2 states between REM and non-REM sleep. That's what comes up.
So, okay, we have some food next door. Please come join us. Thank you, Emery.